Hello horror lovers, welcome to the channel. Before the terror begins, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel, as it will help me a lot. Also, leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from, I'd love to know. Click the like button, all of this because the forest loomed before me, a wall of darkness punctuated by the fading light of dusk. I'd been wandering for hours, hopelessly lost after my ill-fated hiking trip turned into a nightmare. My water bottle was empty, my phone dead, and the chill of the approaching night sent shivers down my spine. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. "Is anyone out there?" Silence was my only answer, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I was about to give up hope when I saw it, a faint, shimmering light in the distance. My heart raced as I squinted, trying to make sure it wasn't just my imagination. "Oh, thank God," I whispered, relief washing over me. It had to be a sign of civilization, maybe a cabin or a campsite. I started moving towards it, my tired legs finding new energy. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't just one light, but several. They danced and weaved between the trees, almost as if they were alive. It was mesmerizing, and I found myself drawn to them like a moth to a flame. "Hello?" I called out again, louder this time. "I see your lights. I need help." The lights seemed to pulse in response, growing brighter for a moment before dimming again. I quickened my pace, pushing through the underbrush, ignoring the branches that whipped at my face and arms. As I drew nearer, a nagging doubt began to creep into my mind. The lights didn't look quite right for lanterns or flashlights. They were too fluid, too ethereal. "What the hell are they?" I muttered to myself. Suddenly I realized the forest had gone eerily silent. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, just an oppressive, unnatural quiet that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Hello?" I called out once more, my voice barely above a whisper now. Is someone there?" The lights continued their hypnotic dance, leading me deeper into the forest. Part of me wanted to turn back, to run away from this strange phenomenon. But I was too exhausted, too desperate for help to give up now. As I pushed through a dense thicket, I stumbled into a small clearing. The dancing lights were all around me now, pulsing with an otherworldly glow. But it was what lay ahead that made my breath catch in my throat. There, partially hidden by vines and overgrowth, was the yawning mouth of a cave. "Oh no," I whispered, my eyes wide with fear. No, no, no. The lights were coming from inside the cave, their eerie glow spilling out into the clearing. Everything in me screamed to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But as I stood there, frozen in terror, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Chanting, faint but distinct, echoing from deep within the cave. "This can't be happening," I said to myself, my voice trembling. "This has to be a dream." But I knew it wasn't. The chill air on my skin, the smell of damp earth, the sound of my own ragged breathing. It was all too real. As I stood there, torn between the need for help and the instinct to flee, one of the lights floated towards me. It hovered just inches from my face, its glow hypnotic and alluring. A voice, barely more than a whisper, seemed to come from the light itself. "Join us, Peter. We've been waiting for you." In that moment, I knew I had stumbled upon something far more terrifying than being lost in the woods. And as the light began to drift back towards the cave, I realized with horror that my feet were already moving to follow it. The cave's entrance loomed before me, a gaping maw of darkness that seemed to swallow all light. Despite every instinct screaming at me to run, I found myself drawn forward, the hypnotic lights guiding my steps. As I crossed the threshold, the damp air clung to my skin like a cold, clammy shroud. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the stone walls. "Is anyone there?" No response came, save for the faint sound of chanting growing louder as I ventured deeper into the cave. The glowing lights danced ahead, leading me through twisting passages and cavernous chambers. My flashlight, long since dead, was useless against the oppressive darkness that pressed in from all sides. As I rounded a corner, I froze. The chanting was clear now, a rhythmic drone that sent shivers down my spine. I pressed myself against the cold stone wall, heart pounding in my chest. What the hell have I gotten myself into? I whispered to myself, fear gripping every fiber of my being. Peering around the edge of the passage, I saw a sight that would haunt me for the rest of my days. A large chamber opened up before me, illuminated by dozens of flickering torches. In the center stood a crude stone altar, its surface dark with what I prayed wasn't blood. Surrounding the altar were robed figures, at least 24 of them, swaying in unison as they chanted in a language I couldn't understand. Their faces were hidden by deep hoods, but there was something disturbingly familiar about their builds and movements. One figure, taller than the rest, raised their arms and the chanting intensified. "Brothers and sisters," a deep voice boomed, "the time of sacrifice approaches. Our offering will appease the Ancient Ones and bring forth their blessings." A murmur of excitement rippled through the gathered cultists. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there paralyzed with fear, but my body refused to obey, rooted to the spot as the horrific scene unfolded before me. Two robed figures dragged a bound and struggling form towards the altar. As they passed a torch, the flickering light illuminated the victim's face, and I had to bite back a gasp of recognition. It was Sarah, a girl I knew from town who had gone missing weeks ago. "Please," Sarah begged, her voice hoarse with fear. "Let me go. I won't tell anyone, I swear." The lead cultist approached her, placing a hand on her cheek in a grotesque parody of comfort. "Hush, child. Your sacrifice will usher in a new age of darkness and power. You should be honored." As they lifted Sarah onto the altar, my stomach churned violently. I wanted to help her to stop this madness, but what could I do against so many? And a traitorous part of my mind whispered, "Better her than you." The lead cultist raised a wicked-looking dagger, its blade glinting in the torchlight. "With this offering," he intoned, "we renew our pact with the Ancient Ones. May their darkness consume the world." Just as the dagger began its descent, a stray piece of loose stone skittered across the cave floor beneath my feet. The sound, amplified by the cave's acoustics, echoed like a gunshot. The chanting stopped abruptly. My heart nearly stopped as dozens of hooded heads turned in my direction. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then the lead cultist's voice rang out, chilling me to the bone. "It seems we have an uninvited guest. Seize them." As the robed figures began to move towards me, I finally found the strength to move. Turning on my heel, I ran blindly into the darkness, the sounds of pursuit close behind. The nightmare I had stumbled upon was all too real, and now I was running for my life through the twisting passages of this accursed cave. My lungs burned as I ran, the sound of pursuit echoing off the cave walls. I stumbled through the darkness, one hand trailing along the cold stone to guide me. The chanting had given way to shouts and the pounding of feet. "Find the intruder," a voice bellowed. "They must not escape." I pressed myself into a small alcove, trying to control my ragged breathing. The glow of torchlight flickered in the passage I'd just fled, growing brighter. I closed my eyes, praying to whatever god might listen that they'd pass me by. Footsteps approached, slowing as they neared my hiding spot. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense with fear. Come out wherever you are," a sickeningly familiar voice sing-songed. My eyes flew open in shock. I knew that voice. "Jim?" I whispered, incredulous. Jim was my next-door neighbor, a mild-mannered accountant who I'd known for years. The footsteps stopped right in front of my alcove. "Peter, is that you?" Jim's voice had lost its menacing tone, replaced by genuine surprise. "What are you doing here?" I stepped out, my mind reeling. Jim stood before me in his cultist robe, hood pushed back to reveal his familiar, friendly face. "Jim, what the hell is going on? What is all this?" Jim's expression hardened. "You shouldn't be here, Peter. You don't understand what we're trying to accomplish." "Accomplish?" I sputtered. You're killing people. I saw you about to sacrifice Sarah. Sacrifices must be made for the greater good, Jim said, his voice eerily calm. Our work will usher in a new age of power and enlightenment. I shook my head, backing away. This is insane, Jim. You can't really believe that. Jim reached out, grasping my arm. Let me show you, Peter. Let me help you understand. Before I could react, more cultists rounded the corner. One of them called out, Brother Jim, have you found the intruder? Jim hesitated for a moment, his grip on my arm tightening. I saw conflict in his eyes, a battle between the man I knew and the cultist he'd become. Then his expression hardened. No, he called back. No sign of them here. Check the eastern passages. As the other cultists hurried away, Jim turned back to me. Run, Peter, he whispered urgently. Run and don't look back. Forget everything you've seen here tonight. But, I started to protest. Go, Jim hissed, shoving me towards a dark passage. I can't protect you if they find you again. I stumbled into the darkness, my mind whirling. As I ran, I heard Jim's voice echo behind me, resuming the haunting chant. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing against a damp cave wall. The sounds of pursuit had faded, but the horrors I'd witnessed played on repeat in my mind. Sarah on the altar, the wicked dagger poised to strike, Jim in his cultist robe. A wave of nausea hit me as the full impact of what I'd seen sank in. I retched, my empty stomach heaving. As I wiped my mouth with a shaking hand, a new sound reached my ears. The soft babble of running water. Hope surged through me. Where there was water, there might be a way out. I stumbled towards the sound, my legs trembling with exhaustion and fear. As I rounded a corner, I saw it. A small underground stream disappearing into a narrow crevice. Faint moonlight filtered through, a beacon of hope in the darkness. Please, I muttered, approaching the crevice. Please let me fit. I squeezed into the narrow opening, the cold water soaking my clothes. Inch by agonizing inch, I pulled myself through, the rough stone scraping my skin raw. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I felt a rush of cool night air. With a final push, I tumbled out of the crevice and onto soft forest loam. I lay there for a moment, gulping in the fresh air, tears of relief streaming down my face. But I knew I couldn't rest yet. Somewhere in the cave behind me, a cult of my neighbors was performing bloody rituals, and they knew I had seen them. With trembling limbs, I forced myself to my feet and began to run once more, praying I could find my way out of this nightmare forest before the cultists found me again. The forest was a blur of shadows and moonlight as I ran, branches whipping at my face and roots threatening to trip me with every step. My mind raced, trying to process the horrors I'd witnessed in the cave. The cult, the sacrifice, Jim. It was all too much to comprehend. This can't be real. I gasped between ragged breaths. This can't be happening. But the ache in my muscles and the sting of cuts on my skin told me it was all too real. I had no idea how long I'd been running or in which direction. All I knew was that I had to put as much distance between myself and that accursed cave as possible. Suddenly, my foot caught on a hidden root, sending me sprawling to the forest floor. I lay there for a moment, the taste of blood and dirt in my mouth, my body screaming in protest. Get up, I muttered to myself. Get up, Peter. They could be right behind you. As if in response to my fears, I heard a distant shout. Then another. The cultists had emerged from the cave and were spreading out into the forest. Panic gave me a fresh surge of energy. I scrambled to my feet, looking wildly around for somewhere to hide. A large, hollow log caught my eye, and I dove for it without hesitation. I squeezed into the decaying wood, trying to quiet my breathing as footsteps approached. Through a small gap, I could see two robed figures moving through the trees. The master wants him found, one of them said, voice muffled by their hood. He knows too much. The other nodded. Spread out. He couldn't have gotten far. As they moved past my hiding spot, I held my breath, praying they wouldn't notice the log. Once their footsteps faded, I allowed myself to breathe again. Think, Peter, I whispered to myself. You need a plan. I couldn't stay in the log forever, but venturing out seemed suicidal with cultists combing the forest. As I weighed my options, a new sound reached my ears, the distant rumble of traffic. Hope surged through me. If I could reach a road, I might have a chance at escape. Carefully, I extracted myself from the log, wincing as my bruised body protested. I began to move towards the sound, trying to stay low and quiet. The forest seemed to press in around me, every shadow potentially hiding a cultist lying in wait. As I neared the edge of the trees, I saw the welcome sight of streetlights in the distance, but between me and safety lay a stretch of open ground, bathed in moonlight. Come on, I urged myself. You're so close, just run for it. I took a deep breath, muscles tensing to sprint, and then froze as a twig snapped behind me. Well, well, a familiar voice said. Look who we have here. I turned slowly to see Jim emerging from the shadows, his cultist robe discarded, replaced by normal clothes. He looked exactly like the friendly neighbor I'd known for years, except for the cold glint in his eyes and the wicked-looking knife in his hand. Jim, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Please, you don't have to do this. We can both just walk away. Jim shook his head, a sad smile on his face. I'm sorry, Peter. I truly am. But you've seen too much. The old ones demand silence. As he raised the knife, time seemed to slow. In that moment, I saw my life flash before my eyes and realized I wasn't ready for it to end. With a desperate cry, I lunged at Jim, catching him off guard. We grappled, the knife between us, each fighting for our lives. In the distance, I could hear shouts as other cultists converged on our location. As we struggled, I knew that the next few moments would determine not just my fate, but the fate of everyone in town who had no idea of the evil lurking in their midst. With renewed determination, I fought on, praying for a miracle. The world spun in a blur of moonlight and shadows as Jim and I grappled. The knife glinted menacingly between us, a deadly promise of what would happen if I faltered even for a moment. Give it up, Peter, Jim grunted, his face contorted with effort. You can't win this. I didn't waste breath on a reply, focusing all my energy on keeping that blade away from my flesh. We stumbled and swayed, locked in our desperate dance, neither willing to yield. Suddenly, my foot slipped on a patch of wet leaves. I felt myself falling, saw triumph flash in Jim's eyes as he pressed his advantage. Time seemed to slow as the knife descended towards my chest. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I twisted, using our momentum to pull Jim down with me. We hit the forest floor hard, the impact jarring the knife from his grasp. It skittered away into the underbrush. No! Jim cried out, lunging for the weapon. I seized my chance, scrambling to my feet and bolting towards the distant road. Behind me, I could hear Jim's curses and the shouts of other cultists converging on our location. My lungs burned as I ran, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. But the promise of safety, of escape from this nightmare, drove me on. As I burst from the tree line, the glare of headlights momentarily blinded me. I heard the screech of brakes and a car horn blaring. Hey, watch it, you idiot, a man's voice yelled. I blinked, my eyes adjusting to see a pickup truck idling on the road, its driver leaning out the window with a look of annoyed concern. Please, I gasped, stumbling towards the vehicle. Please, you have to help me. They're after me. The driver's expression changed from annoyance to alarm. Who's after you? Are you okay, buddy? Before I could answer, a shout came from the forest edge. There he is. I whirled to see Jim emerging from the trees, followed by several robed figures. The sight seemed to jolt the driver into action. Get in, he yelled, reaching across to fling open the passenger door. I didn't need to be told twice. I dove into the truck just as Jim reached the road. Drive, I shouted. For God's sake, drive. The driver slammed on the gas and we peeled away in a spray of gravel. In the side mirror, I could see Jim and the others growing smaller. their figures silhouetted against the moonlit forest. As the adrenaline began to ebb, the full weight of what had happened crashed over me. I started shaking uncontrollably, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Hey, take it easy," the driver said, casting worried glances my way. "You're safe now. I'm Mike, by the way. Want to tell me what the hell that was all about?" I looked at Mike, this stranger who had unwittingly saved my life. How could I possibly explain what I'd seen, what I'd been through? Who would believe such a horrific tale? I'm Peter, I managed. "And you wouldn't believe me if I told you." Mike was quiet for a moment, then said, "Try me. I've seen some pretty weird shit in my time." As the truck ate up the miles, putting blessed distance between us and that accursed forest, I found myself pouring out the whole terrifying story. The lights, the cave, the ritual, Jim, all of it. To his credit, Mike listened without interruption. When I finally fell silent, emotionally and physically exhausted, he let out a low whistle. "That's quite a story, Peter," he said slowly. "If even half of it is true, we need to get you to the police." I shook my head vehemently. No police. You don't understand. These people, they're everywhere. Neighbors, friends. Who knows how deep this goes? Mike frowned, but nodded. "All right, no police for now. But you need help, man, and a safe place to lay low." As we drove through the night, I realized that while I had escaped the immediate danger, my ordeal was far from over. The cult was still out there, and they knew I had seen too much. My life as I knew it was over, and I had no idea what the dawn would bring. But for now, in this stranger's truck, I allowed myself a moment of relief. I had survived, and somehow, I would find a way to expose the evil lurking in the shadows of my town. The first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon as Mike's truck rumbled to a stop outside a small, weathered cabin. We had driven through the night, putting miles between us and the horrors I had witnessed in the forest. "It's not much," Mike said, killing the engine, "but it's off the grid and safe, my hunting cabin." I nodded, too exhausted to speak. Every muscle in my body ached, and my mind was still reeling from the night's events. As we got out of the truck, the crisp morning air helped clear my head a little. "Thank you," I managed, my voice hoarse. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." Mike waved off my gratitude. "Don't mention it. Let's get you inside and cleaned up. You look like you've been through hell." As we entered the cabin, I caught sight of my reflection in a small mirror by the door. I barely recognized myself. My clothes were torn and filthy, my face scratched and streaked with dirt and blood. Mike busied himself starting a fire in the small wood stove while I sank into a worn armchair, my legs finally giving out. "So," Mike said, once the fire was crackling, "what's your plan now?" I let out a bitter laugh. "Plan? I don't have a plan. My whole world just got turned upside down. I found out my neighbors are part of some murderous cult. How do you plan for that?" Mike nodded solemnly. "Fair point. But you can't hide forever. Sooner or later, you'll need to face this." "Face it?" I scoffed. "How? Go to the police?" "Excuse me, officer. I'd like to report a human sacrifice in a cave in the woods. Oh, and by the way, half the town is involved. They'd think I was insane." "Maybe," Mike conceded. "But you can't just do nothing. These people are killing innocent folks. Someone has to stop them." I stood up, pacing the small cabin. "And that someone has to be me? I'm not a hero, Mike. I'm just me. I'm in way over my head here." Mike was quiet for a moment, then said, "My pa used to say, sometimes the right thing and the hard thing are the same thing. Sounds to me like you're the only one who knows what's really going on. That makes it your responsibility." His words hit me hard. I sank back into the chair, my head in my hands. "I don't know if I can do this," I whispered. "Maybe not alone," Mike said. "But you're not alone anymore." I looked up at him, surprised. "You mean?" Mike nodded. "I'm in. Whatever this is, whatever we're up against, I'll help you fight it." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a glimmer of hope. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Don't thank me yet," Mike replied with a grim smile. "We've got a long road ahead of us. But first you need rest, and a shower," he added, wrinkling his nose. As I headed to the small bathroom, I caught sight of myself in the mirror again. The face looking back at me was still battered and scared, but there was something else there now. A determination I hadn't seen before. "We're coming for you," I whispered, thinking of Jim and the other cultists. "Whatever it takes, we're going to stop you." As I stepped into the shower, letting the hot water wash away the physical remnants of my ordeal, I knew that the real battle was just beginning. The cult was still out there, still a threat to everyone I cared about. But now, I wasn't facing them alone. With Mike's help, maybe, just maybe, we stood a chance of exposing the truth and putting an end to the darkness that had taken root in my town. It wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't be safe. But as Mike had said, sometimes the right thing and the hard thing are the same. As I emerged from the bathroom clean but still battered, I found Mike at the cabin's small table, poring over maps of the area. "Ready to start planning?" he asked, looking up at me. I took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready as I'll ever be. Let's do this." And with that, we began to formulate our strategy to take on the cult, neither of us fully realizing just how deep this conspiracy went, or the dangers that lay ahead. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead, their harsh glare making me feel exposed and vulnerable. Mike sat beside me, his steady presence a comforting anchor in the storm of uncertainty that surrounded us. We had decided that, despite my reservations, we needed to at least try to involve the authorities. Officer Jenkins, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and skeptical eyes, sat across from us, his pen poised over a notepad. "So, Mr. Harrison," he began, his tone carefully neutral, "why don't you start from the beginning?" I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts. "It started when I got lost in the woods," I began, my voice shaking slightly. "I saw these strange lights." As I recounted my harrowing experience, I could see the disbelief growing in Officer Jenkins' eyes. When I got to the part about the cult and the attempted sacrifice, he held up a hand to stop me. "Let me get this straight," he said, his voice tinged with incredulity. "You're saying that a group of respected members of our community are part of a secret cult that performs human sacrifices in a cave in the woods?" I nodded, feeling a sense of desperation creeping in. "I know how it sounds, but it's true. I saw it with my own eyes. Jim Taylor, my neighbor, he was there. He tried to kill me." Officer Jenkins exchanged a glance with his partner, who had been silently observing from the corner. "Mr. Harrison," he said slowly, "Jim Taylor is a respected businessman and a pillar of this community. Are you sure you weren't confused? Maybe still affected by your ordeal in the woods?" "I'm not confused," I insisted, my voice rising. "I know what I saw." Mike put a calming hand on my arm. "Peter, take it easy," he murmured. Officer Jenkins leaned back in his chair, his expression a mixture of concern and skepticism. "Mr. Harrison, we take all reports seriously, but you have to understand these are very serious allegations. Without any concrete evidence—" "Evidence?" I interrupted, frustration boiling over. "What about Sarah? The girl they were going to sacrifice. She's been missing for weeks." A flicker of interest passed over the officer's face. "Sarah Brooks? Yes, we have an open missing persons case for her. But there's been no indication of foul play." "Because the cult took her," I exclaimed, desperation clear in my voice. Officer Jenkins sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Mr. Harrison, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience, but we can't just go accusing upstanding citizens of murder based on, well, frankly, a rather fantastic story." I slumped in my chair, the fight draining out of me. I could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe a word I was saying. As we left the station, the weight of our failure pressed down on me. "They think I'm crazy," I muttered, more to myself than to Mike. Mike squeezed my shoulder reassuringly. Hey, we knew this was a long shot, but at least we tried. Now we know we're on our own. As we walked to Mike's truck, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every passing car, every person on the street suddenly seemed suspicious. What do we do now? I asked, my voice low. Mike's expression was grim but determined. We do what we have to. We gather evidence, build our case, and we stay alert. If these people are as dangerous as you say, they're not going to just let this go. As we drove away from the station, I couldn't help but feel we had just painted targets on our backs. The cult was still out there, still a threat. And now they knew I was talking. The real battle was just beginning, and I had never felt more alone and vulnerable in my life. But as I glanced at Mike, his jaw set with determination, I realized I wasn't truly alone. Whatever came next, we would face it together. And somehow, some way, we would expose the truth and bring this nightmare to an end. The days following our failed attempt to involve the police blurred together in a haze of paranoia and sleepless nights. Every shadow seemed to hide a cultist. Every unexpected sound made me jump. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see Jim or one of his robed companions lurking nearby. One afternoon, as I nervously peeked through the blinds of Mike's cabin, I caught sight of my neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, walking her dog across the street. She glanced up at the window and I quickly ducked out of sight, my heart pounding. "You okay, Peter?" Mike called from the kitchen. I let out a shaky breath. "Yeah, just seeing things again." Mike emerged, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "You can't keep going on like this, man. You need to sleep." "How can I sleep?" I snapped, more harshly than I intended. "Every time I close my eyes, I see that cave, that altar, Sarah's terrified face." Mike's expression softened. "I know, buddy. But we're not going to be any use to Sarah or anyone else if we're falling apart." I nodded, running a hand through my unkempt hair. "You're right. I'm sorry. I feel so helpless." "Then let's do something about it," Mike said, his tone resolute. "We need a plan." Over the next few hours, we brainstormed, trying to figure out our next move. As night fell, I found myself hunched over Mike's laptop, scrolling through local news articles. "Look at this," I said, gesturing Mike over. "There's been a string of disappearances over the past year, not just Sarah." Mike leaned in, his brow furrowed. "You think they're all connected to the cult?" I nodded grimly. "It fits the pattern. Young people, mostly. All vanished without a trace." As we dug deeper, a chilling picture began to emerge. The disappearances seemed to coincide with certain lunar phases, and many of the missing had last been seen near the forest where I'd encountered the cult. "This is big, Mike," I whispered, a mix of fear and excitement in my voice. "We might be onto something here." Just then, a sharp knock at the door made us both jump. We exchanged wary glances. "Were you expecting anyone?" I whispered. Mike shook his head, reaching for the baseball bat he'd started keeping nearby. Slowly, he approached the door. "Who is it?" he called out. A muffled female voice responded, "Please, I need help. I think someone's following me." Mike hesitated, then looked back at me. I shrugged helplessly. After a moment's deliberation, he slowly opened the door. A young woman stood there, her clothes dirty and torn, her eyes wild with fear. My jaw dropped as I recognized her. "Sarah?" I gasped. She looked at me, confusion flickering across her face. "Do I know you?" Before I could respond, she stumbled forward, collapsing into Mike's arms. As he carried her to the couch, I closed and locked the door, my mind racing. "How did you escape?" I asked as Mike fetched a glass of water. We feared the worst." Sarah took a shaky sip of water. I can't remember much. There was a cave and people in robes, and then it's all a blur. I've been running for days, I think." As she spoke, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On her wrist was a strange symbol, one I'd seen etched on the cave walls. Mike, I said, my voice tight. We need to talk. Now. As we stepped into the kitchen, leaving Sarah on the couch, I couldn't shake the feeling that things had just gotten a lot more complicated. Her appearance should have been a relief, a vindication of our suspicions. Instead, it felt like we'd just stepped deeper into the mystery, with dangers lurking around every corner. What do we do now? Mike whispered. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. We keep digging. Sarah's survival is proof we're on the right track. But we need to be careful. If she found us, others might too. As we returned to the living room, ready to gently question Sarah further, I couldn't help but feel that we were standing on the precipice of something much larger and more terrifying than we'd initially imagined. The real challenge was only just beginning. The soft glow of the laptop screen illuminated the dim cabin as I hunched over it, my eyes burning from hours of intense research. Maps of the forest area were spread across the table, each marked with potential locations of the cave and reported disappearances. Mike sat across from me, his brow furrowed in concentration as he pored over old newspaper clippings. Anything? I asked, breaking the tense silence. Mike shook his head. Nothing concrete, but there's definitely a pattern here. Every few months someone goes missing, always around the same time of the lunar cycle. I nodded, a chill running down my spine. It matches what we saw in the cave. They must be timing their rituals with the moon phases. As I zoomed in on a particularly dense area of the forest on my digital map, a sharp knock at the door made us both jump. We exchanged wary glances, the memory of Sarah's unexpected arrival still fresh in our minds. I'll get it, Mike said, reaching for the baseball bat he now kept near the door. He approached cautiously, calling out, "Who is it?" "Peter, it's me, Lisa, your friend from work. Can we talk?" My heart raced. Lisa was indeed a colleague, but we weren't particularly close. What was she doing here? I nodded to Mike, who slowly opened the door. Lisa stood there, looking nervous and slightly disheveled. "Lisa," I said, approaching cautiously, "what's going on? How did you find me here?" She stepped inside, her eyes darting around the cabin. "I've been worried about you, Peter. You haven't been to work in days. I overheard some people talking. They're looking for you." My blood ran cold. "Who's looking for me, Lisa?" She hesitated, wringing her hands. "I'm not sure, but they seemed dangerous. I thought I should warn you." As Lisa spoke, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. On her wrist, partially hidden by her sleeve, was a familiar symbol, the same one I'd seen on Sarah and in the cave. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Lisa, that's a nice bracelet. Where did you get it?" Her hand instinctively moved to cover her wrist. "Oh, this? It's nothing, just a trinket." Mike, who had been quietly observing, suddenly tensed. "Peter," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to talk, now." As we stepped into the kitchen, leaving Lisa in the main room, Mike whispered, "She's one of them, isn't she?" I nodded grimly. "I think so, but why is she here? Is it a trap?" Before Mike could respond, we heard a commotion from the other room. We rushed back to find Lisa struggling with Sarah, who had apparently woken up and recognized her. "You!" Sarah screamed, her eyes wild with fear and anger. "You were there! In the cave!" Lisa's demeanor changed instantly. Gone was the nervous colleague, replaced by someone cold and determined. "You shouldn't have run, Sarah. And you." She turned to me, her eyes narrowing. "You should have stayed lost in the woods." Everything happened in a blur. Lisa reached into her jacket, but Mike was faster. He tackled her to the ground as I rushed to restrain Sarah, who was still trying to attack Lisa. As we struggled to control the situation, I couldn't help but feel that we'd just stumbled into something far bigger and more dangerous than we'd imagined. The cult's reach was clearly greater than we'd thought, extending into our everyday lives. Once we had both women restrained, Mike turned to me, his expression grim. "What now?" I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. Now we get answers. It's time we stopped reacting and started taking the fight to them. As I looked at Lisa, her eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and something that looked unsettlingly like pity, I knew we were at a turning point. Whatever came next would define not just our fate, but potentially the fate of our entire town. "Start talking," I said to Lisa, my voice steadier than I felt, "and don't leave anything out." The night stretched ahead of us, full of dark revelations and difficult decisions. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like we might actually have a chance at uncovering the truth and stopping this madness once and for all. The cabin felt claustrophobic as dawn broke, tension thick in the air. Lisa sat bound to a chair, her earlier bravado replaced by a stony silence. Sarah huddled in a corner, her eyes darting between us nervously. Mike stood guard by the door while I paced the room, trying to gather my thoughts. "Let's try this again," I said, my voice hoarse from a night of fruitless interrogation. "Why did you come here, Lisa?" She lifted her chin defiantly. "I told you. To warn you." "Warn us?" Mike scoffed. "You're one of them." Lisa's eyes flashed. "You don't understand. None of you do. What we're doing, it's necessary." "Necessary?" Sarah suddenly spoke up, her voice trembling. "How is kidnapping and murder necessary?" Lisa turned to her, something like pity in her eyes. "It's not murder, it's sacrifice, for the greater good." I knelt in front of Lisa, forcing her to meet my gaze. What greater good could possibly justify what I saw in that cave? For a moment, Lisa's mask slipped, and I saw a flicker of doubt. "The balance," she whispered. "We maintain the balance." Before I could press further, a loud crash echoed from outside. Mike rushed to the window. "Shit," he hissed. "We've got company." My heart raced as I peered out. 3 black SUVs had pulled up, and robed figures were emerging, led by a familiar face. Jim Taylor. "Peter," Jim's voice boomed. "We know you're in there. Come out, and no one needs to get hurt." Mike turned to me, his expression grim. "What's the play?" I glanced at Lisa and Sarah, then back to Mike. "We need to get out of here. Is there a back way?" He nodded. "There's a trail through the woods, but we'll need to move fast." As Mike quickly gathered supplies, I turned to Lisa. "Last chance, are you with us or them?" She hesitated, conflict clear on her face. Finally, she spoke. "Untie me. I'll help you." Against my better judgment, I cut her bonds. "Don't make me regret this." We slipped out the back just as the front door splintered. The forest engulfed us, the sound of pursuit not far behind. As we ran, Lisa spoke between breaths. "There's a place, a safe house. They don't know about it." "Why should we trust you?" Sarah panted. Lisa's eyes were haunted. "Because I've seen too much, done too much. This has to end." We pushed deeper into the woods, the sounds of our pursuers fading. After what felt like hours, we reached a small, overgrown cabin. "Here," Lisa said, fumbling with a hidden key. Once inside, we collapsed, exhausted. As we caught our breath, I turned to Lisa. "All right," I said. "It's time for the whole truth. What is this cult really about?" Lisa took a deep breath. "It's called the Order of the Eternal Balance. They believe that to maintain cosmic harmony, sacrifices must be made. But lately, the sacrifices have become more frequent, more brutal." "Why?" Mike asked. "Because the balance is shifting," Lisa whispered. "Something's coming. Something big." A chill ran down my spine. "What's coming?" Lisa's eyes met mine, filled with fear. "The end, unless we stop it." As her words sank in, I realized we were no longer just fighting a local cult. We were caught in the middle of something far larger and more terrifying than we could have imagined. "So," I said, looking at each of my unlikely companions, "where do we go from here?" The weight of the question hung in the air. The fate of not just our town, but possibly the world, resting on our next move. As the sun set outside our hidden refuge, I couldn't shake the feeling that our real journey was only just beginning. The safe house creaked and groaned in the wind as night fell. Our small group huddled around a flickering lantern. The weight of Lisa's revelation hung heavy in the air. I rubbed my temples, trying to process everything we'd learned. "Okay," I said, breaking the tense silence. "Let's go over this again. The Order believes they're maintaining some kind of cosmic balance." Lisa nodded, her face pale in the dim light. "Yes. They believe that by performing rituals and sacrifices, they keep chaos at bay." Mike scoffed. "That's insane. How could they possibly think—" "Because it works," Lisa interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. Or at least it did. Sarah, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward. "What do you mean, did?" Lisa's eyes darted nervously around the room before settling on me. "The rituals. They've always had an effect. Small things at first. Good harvests, fewer natural disasters. But lately, it's like the universe is demanding more." I felt a chill run down my spine. "More sacrifices?" She nodded grimly. "And not just that. The rituals are becoming more complex, more dangerous. It's like we're trying to plug a leak in a dam that's about to burst." Mike stood up abruptly, pacing the small room. "This is crazy. We can't seriously be considering that this mumbo-jumbo is real?" I shared his skepticism, but the memory of what I'd seen in that cave, the unearthly lights, the palpable sense of otherworldly power, gave me pause. "Real or not," I said slowly, "people are dying, and we need to stop it." Sarah hugged herself tightly. "But how? They're everywhere, and they're powerful." A determined glint appeared in Lisa's eye. "Not everywhere, and not as powerful as they think." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. "This is the Order's grimoire. It contains all their rituals, their secrets." My eyes widened. "You stole it?" Lisa nodded. "I've been having doubts for a while. When I overheard them talking about you, Peter, I knew I had to act." As she flipped through the pages, strange symbols and diagrams flickered in the lantern light. She stopped on a page near the end. "This is what they're preparing for," she said, her finger tracing an ominous illustration of what looked like a tear in reality. "The convergence. When our world and something else align." Mike leaned in, his skepticism warring with curiosity. "And what happens during this convergence?" Lisa's voice trembled. "If it's not handled correctly, the end of everything we know." A heavy silence fell over the room as we absorbed the magnitude of what we were facing. Finally, I spoke up. "So what's our move? We can't just sit here and wait for the apocalypse." Lisa closed the grimoire with a snap. "We need to disrupt their rituals. If we can prevent them from completing the preparatory rites, we might be able to stop the convergence altogether." Sarah's eyes widened. "But won't that throw off the balance they've been maintaining?" Lisa nodded grimly. "It's a risk, but at this point, it's our only choice." I stood up, a mix of determination and fear coursing through me. "All right, where do we start?" Lisa opened the book again, pointing to a map. "There are 5 sacred sites around town. They need to activate all of them before the convergence. If we can desecrate even one—" Mike finished her thought. "We might just save the world." As we huddled around the grimoire, planning our first move, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were stepping into something far beyond our understanding. The fate of everything we knew hung in the balance, and we were the only ones who could tip the scales. "Let's get to work," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We've got a lot to do and not much time to do it." As we delved into the arcane secrets of the Order, the wind outside seemed to whisper of the challenges that lay ahead. Our journey into the heart of an ancient cosmic conflict, had only just begun. The pale light of dawn was just beginning to streak the sky as we approached the first sacred site. According to Lisa's grimoire, it was an ancient stone circle hidden deep in the woods, rarely visited by hikers or locals. As we crept through the underbrush, the air seemed to thicken, pressing against us like an invisible barrier. "We're close," Lisa whispered, her eyes darting nervously around the forest. "Can you feel it?" I nodded, a chill running down my spine that had nothing to do with the early morning air. There was a palpable sense of something in the atmosphere. Power? Dread? I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Suddenly, Mike held up a hand, signaling us to stop. "Listen," he hissed. Through the trees, we could hear the faint sound of chanting. My heart raced as I realized we weren't alone. "Shit," Sarah muttered. "They're already here." We crouched behind a large fallen log, peering over it cautiously. In a small clearing ahead, we could see 5 robed figures standing in a circle around a central stone altar. On the altar lay an assortment of strange objects, crystals, bones, and what looked disturbingly like a ceremonial dagger. "We're too late," Lisa breathed, her face pale. "They've already started the ritual." I felt a surge of determination. "No, we're not too late. We can still stop this." Mike looked at me skeptically. "How? We're outnumbered and they've got a head start." I turned to Lisa. "The grimoire, does it say anything about how to disrupt a ritual in progress?" She bit her lip, flipping through the pages frantically. "Yes, here. If we can break their circle or remove one of the ritual objects, it should be enough to nullify the ceremony." Sarah's eyes widened. "But how do we do that without getting caught, or worse?" I took a deep breath, my mind racing. We need a distraction, something to draw at least some of them away from the circle. Mike nodded grimly. "I can do that. I'll lead them on a wild goose chase through the woods." "No," I said firmly. "It's too dangerous. We stick together." Just then, a piercing screech echoed through the forest, causing all of us to jump. The cultists paused in their chanting, looking around warily. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Lisa's face had gone even paler. "It's starting. The veil between worlds is thinning." As if to emphasize her point, the air around us seemed to shimmer like heat waves rising from asphalt on a hot day. In the distance, I could have sworn I saw something move between the trees, something that shouldn't exist in our world. "We're out of time," I said, my voice tight with urgency. "We have to move now." Without waiting for a response, I burst from our hiding place, sprinting toward the stone circle. I could hear the others shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. My focus was entirely on the altar and the objects atop it. The cultists, caught off guard by my sudden appearance, fumbled to respond. One reached for the ceremonial dagger, but I was faster. I snatched it off the altar, along with a handful of the other objects, and kept running. "Stop him!" I heard someone shout, but I was already disappearing into the trees on the other side of the clearing. As I ran, I could feel the objects in my hands growing warm, almost uncomfortably so. The forest around me seemed to twist and warp, reality bending in ways that made my head spin, but I kept going, driven by the knowledge that the fate of our world might depend on my actions in this moment. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of pursuit mingling with otherworldly shrieks and the continuing chants of the remaining cultists. Somewhere in the chaos, I hoped the others had found a way to safety. As I plunged deeper into the increasingly surreal forest, one thought pounded in my mind. This was only the beginning. We had disrupted one ritual, but there were 4 more sites to go. And with each step, I feared we were running out of time. The world was changing around us, and we were the only ones who could set it right. If we survived long enough to try. My lungs burned as I crashed through the underbrush. The stolen ritual objects clutched tightly to my chest. The forest around me continued to warp and twist, reality bending in ways that made my head spin. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow even more unsettling. Finally, I stumbled into a small clearing and allowed myself to slow down. As I caught my breath, I realized with a start that I was alone. "Mike? Sarah? Lisa?" I called out, my voice hoarse. No response. The forest seemed to swallow my words. Panic started to set in when suddenly I heard rustling from the bushes. I tensed, ready to run again, but relief washed over me as Sarah emerged, followed closely by Mike and Lisa. "Peter," Sarah exclaimed, rushing over to me. "Are you okay?" I nodded, still breathing heavily. "Yeah, I think so. What about you guys?" Mike looked shaken but unharmed. "We're fine. That was intense." Lisa's eyes were fixed on the objects in my hands. "You did it," she breathed. "You actually disrupted the ritual." As if on cue, the items began to vibrate, growing uncomfortably hot. With a yelp, I dropped them to the ground. We all watched in astonishment as they seemed to dissolve, leaving behind nothing but a faint, shimmering residue. "What just happened?" I asked, turning to Lisa. She shook her head, looking both awed and terrified. "The ritual objects, they're tied to the ceremony. By removing them and breaking the circle, you've essentially nullified their power." Mike let out a low whistle. "So we did it? We stopped them?" Lisa's expression grew grim. "For now. But remember, there are still 4 more sites. And now that we've interfered, the Order will be even more determined to complete the remaining rituals." Sarah hugged herself tightly. "What do we do now?" I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts. "We need to regroup. Find somewhere safe to plan our next move." As we started to move, a bone-chilling howl echoed through the forest. We all froze. "What was that?" Mike whispered. Lisa's face had gone pale. "A guardian," she said, her voice barely audible. "The Order must have summoned it to protect the remaining sites." "A guardian?" I repeated. "Like a monster?" She nodded grimly. "Something not of this world. The veil between realities is thinning, allowing them to cross over." Another howl, closer this time. We all instinctively huddled together. "We need to move," I said urgently. "Lisa, is there anywhere nearby we can hide?" She thought for a moment, then nodded. "There's an old church about a mile east of here. It's been abandoned for years, but it might offer some protection." "Protection from what?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Lisa's eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "From what's coming. The Guardians, the Order, the Convergence itself. That church might be our only safe haven." As we set off towards the church, the forest around us continued to shift and change. Strange lights flickered between the trees, and more than once I could have sworn I saw impossible shapes moving just at the edge of my vision. "Stay close," I murmured to the others, "and be ready for anything." The weight of our situation pressed down on me. We had won a small victory, but the war was far from over. As we pushed on through the increasingly alien landscape, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking a tightrope between worlds, and one false step could plunge us into chaos. The old church loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the brightening sky. It looked like a fortress, and I prayed it would be enough to keep us safe from the horrors that now stalked the forest. Because one thing was clear: our battle against the Order and the cosmic forces they had unleashed was only just beginning. The old church loomed before us, its weathered stone walls a stark contrast to the shifting, unnatural forest around us. As we approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched by unseen eyes. "Quick, inside," Lisa urged, pushing open the heavy wooden doors with a creak that echoed through the empty nave. Once inside, Mike and I barricaded the entrance while Sarah and Lisa searched for candles or anything else that might provide light. The stained glass windows filtered the strange, shimmering light from outside, casting eerie patterns across the dusty floor. "So," Mike said, leaning against a pew, "what's our next move?" Before anyone could answer, a low rumble shook the building. Dust rained down from the rafters. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Lisa's face was grim. "The Guardians. They're searching for us." I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. Okay, we need a plan. Lisa, what can you tell us about the remaining ritual sites? She pulled out the grimoire, its pages seeming to glow faintly in the dim light. There are 4 left. Each one corresponds to an element: air, fire, water, and earth. And we need to disrupt all of them? Sarah asked. Lisa nodded. If we don't, the convergence will happen, and our world will be overrun by things from the other side. Another rumble, closer this time. The windows rattled ominously. Mike paced nervously. We can't just sit here waiting for those things to find us. He's right, I said. We need to take the fight to them. Lisa, which site is closest? She consulted the grimoire. The air site. It's at the top of Widow's Peak. I remembered the steep, treacherous climb to the summit of the mountain overlooking our town. That's not going to be an easy trip, especially with those guardians out there. Sarah spoke up, her voice stronger than I expected. Maybe we don't all need to go. We could split up, create a distraction. I shook my head. It's too dangerous. We stick together. Suddenly, a piercing shriek cut through the air, so loud it felt like my skull was vibrating. We all clapped our hands over our ears. They're getting closer, Lisa shouted over the noise. We need to move. As the sound faded, we gathered what supplies we could find. A few candles, an old first aid kit, and some bottled water from a neglected emergency stash. Just as we were about to leave, I noticed something glinting in the shadows near the altar. Curious, I approached and found an ancient-looking sword mounted on the wall. Guys, look at this, I called out. Lisa's eyes widened as she saw the weapon. That's the sword of St. Michael. It's said to have power against supernatural forces. Mike looked skeptical. You think an old piece of metal is going to help us against cosmic horrors? Another earth-shaking rumble answered his question. This time cracks appeared in the church walls. At this point, I said, grabbing the sword, I'm willing to try anything. As I lifted the weapon, I felt a strange tingling in my arm, as if the sword was somehow alive. Okay, I said, turning to face my companions. Here's the plan. We make for Widow's Peak. Move fast, stay together, and if we encounter any guardians... I hefted the sword, its blade catching the strange light filtering through the windows. We fight. Lisa nodded grimly. The Order will be expecting us now. They'll have fortified the remaining sites. Then we'll just have to be smarter and faster, Sarah said, a determined glint in her eye. Mike took a deep breath. I can't believe I'm saying this, but let's go save the world. With one last look at the sanctuary that had briefly sheltered us, we pushed open the back door of the church. The forest beyond seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and in the distance, I could hear the bone-chilling howls of the guardians. As we stepped out into the twisted landscape, the weight of our mission pressed down on me. 4 sites left, 4 chances to prevent the apocalypse, and an army of cosmic horrors standing in our way. Stay close, I murmured, gripping the sword tightly. And whatever happens, don't let them separate us. With that, we plunged into the warped forest, our path set for Widow's Peak and the next stage of our desperate quest to save reality itself. The forest had become a nightmare landscape as we made our way towards Widow's Peak. Trees twisted into impossible shapes, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. The air itself seemed to ripple, occasionally revealing glimpses of otherworldly vistas that made my eyes hurt to look at. Stay close, I called out to the others. The sword of St. Michael held tightly in my grip. Its weight was reassuring, even if I wasn't entirely sure how to use it against the horrors we might face. We had been walking for what felt like hours, the peak still frustratingly distant. Suddenly, Lisa stopped short, her face pale. Wait, she whispered. Do you hear that? We all froze, straining our ears. At first I heard nothing but the unnatural rustling of the warped forest. Then faintly, I caught it. A rhythmic chanting, carried on the wind. Mike's eyes widened. They're already there. The order beat us to the site. Sarah looked panicked. What do we do now? I took a deep breath, trying to think clearly despite the fear coursing through me. We stick to the plan. We have to try and disrupt the ritual. As we started moving again, this time with more urgency, a bone-chilling howl echoed through the trees. It was closer than ever before. "Guardian?" Lisa breathed, her voice barely audible. Before any of us could react, a massive shape burst from the undergrowth. It was like nothing I had ever seen, a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes, with a maw filled with countless razor-sharp teeth. "Run!" I shouted, pushing Sarah and Lisa ahead of me. Mike and I brought up the rear, occasionally glancing back to see the monstrosity gaining on us. The sword in my hand began to vibrate, growing warm to the touch. "Peter!" Mike yelled, pointing ahead. "Look!" Through a gap in the trees, I could see the summit of Widow's Peak. Figures in robes stood in a circle, their chanting now clearly audible. In the center of their circle, a swirling vortex of energy was forming. "We're too late," Lisa cried, her voice filled with despair. "No," I said firmly, "we can still stop this." Just then, the Guardian burst into the clearing behind us. Without thinking, I spun around, the sword raised high. As the creature lunged, I brought the blade down in a gleaming arc. To my amazement, the sword cut through the Guardian like it was made of smoke. The monster let out an unearthly shriek and dissolved into nothingness. For a moment, we all stood in shocked silence. Then Mike let out a whoop of triumph. Holy shit, it worked. But our victory was short-lived. The chanting on the peak grew louder, and the vortex of energy expanded. "Come on," I said, gripping the sword tightly. "We have to end this now." As we raced up the steep slope, the air grew thinner, and the reality distortions more intense. By the time we reached the summit, it felt like we were walking through a dream. The cultists turned as one to face us, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. At their center stood Jim Taylor, his arms raised to the swirling vortex above. "You're too late," he called out, his voice echoing strangely. "The ritual is almost complete. The air elemental will soon be under our control." I raised the sword, its blade now glowing with an inner light. "It's not over yet, Jim. We're here to stop you." Jim's face contorted with rage. "Guardians! To me!" From the vortex above, more monstrous shapes began to emerge. I looked at my companions, saw the fear in their eyes, but also the determination. "Whatever happens," I said, "we're in this together." As the Guardians descended and the cultists advanced, we stood our ground. The fate of our world hung in the balance, and we were the only ones who could tip the scales. With the sword of St. Michael in my hand and my friends at my side, I prepared to face whatever horrors the collapsing barriers between worlds might throw at us. The battle for the air elemental site had begun, and with it the true test of our resolve to save reality itself. Chaos erupted on the summit of Widow's Peak. The Guardians, twisted amalgamations of tentacles and eyes, descended upon us while the cultists continued their eerie chant. The vortex above pulsed with otherworldly energy, growing larger by the second. "Peter, watch out!" Sarah screamed. I ducked just in time as a Guardian's tentacle whipped over my head. The sword of St. Michael hummed in my grip and I swung it in a wide arc. The blade sliced through the creature, causing it to dissipate with an unearthly shriek. Mike was grappling with a cultist trying to break their circle. "A little help here," he called out. Lisa rushed to his aid, her knowledge of the Order's weak points proving invaluable. Together they managed to push two cultists out of formation, disrupting the circle. The effect was immediate. The vortex above us flickered, its swirling energies becoming unstable. Jim Taylor's voice boomed across the mountaintop. "No, you fools! Do you have any idea what you're doing?" I turned to face him, the sword raised defensively. "We're stopping you, Jim. This ends now." His face contorted with rage, and was that fear? "You don't understand. The elemental must be bound, or the consequences will be catastrophic." As if to emphasize his point, the vortex suddenly expanded, tendrils of energy lashing out wildly. The air itself seemed to come alive, whipping around us in a frenzy. Sarah stumbled, nearly being blown off her feet. I reached out and grabbed her hand, pulling her close. "Stay together," I shouted over the howling wind. Lisa's eyes were wide with realization. "Peter, he might be right. If the air elemental is released without proper containment, it could tear apart the fabric of our reality." I felt a moment of doubt. Had we made a terrible mistake? But there was no time to second-guess ourselves now. "What do we do?" Mike yelled, struggling against the increasing winds. Lisa flipped frantically through the grimoire, her hair whipping around her face. There's a binding spell here, but it requires immense power and focus." Jim laughed maniacally. "You see? Only the Order has the strength to control such forces. Surrender now, and perhaps we can still salvage this." I looked at my friends, saw the determination in their eyes despite the fear. Then I gazed at the sword in my hand, its blade glowing brighter than ever. A crazy idea formed in my mind. "Lisa, what if we use the sword to channel the binding spell?" Her eyes widened. It might work. But Peter, the risk." "We don't have a choice," I said grimly. "Tell me what to do." As Lisa began to recite the incantation, I raised the sword of St. Michael high. Energy crackled along its length, and I felt a surge of power unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The vortex above seemed to focus on the blade, its wild energies being drawn towards it. The wind howled louder, and I struggled to keep my footing. "Don't let go, Peter," Sarah shouted, gripping my arm to steady me. Mike and Lisa positioned themselves around me, forming a protective circle. The cultists and remaining guardians pressed in, trying to disrupt us, but my friends held them at bay. I felt the power building to an almost unbearable level. The sword was blazing now, so bright it hurt to look at. Lisa's voice rose to a crescendo, the final words of the spell ringing out over the chaos. With a yell of defiance, I thrust the sword towards the heart of the vortex. There was a blinding flash, a sensation of being torn apart and put back together, and then silence. As my vision cleared, I saw the vortex was gone. The air was still, the guardians had vanished, and the cultists lay unconscious on the ground. Jim Taylor was on his knees, a look of utter disbelief on his face. You actually did it," he whispered. I lowered the sword, feeling completely drained. "It's over, Jim. The air elemental is bound." As the reality of our victory sank in, I turned to my friends. They looked as exhausted as I felt, but there was a glimmer of hope in their eyes. "One down," Mike said with a weak smile. "3 to go." I nodded, gripping the sword tightly. We had won this battle, but the war was far from over. As we prepared to leave the mountaintop, I couldn't shake the feeling that our greatest challenges still lay ahead. The elements of fire, water, and earth awaited us, and with them, the final test of our resolve to save our world from the brink of cosmic chaos. The descent from Widow's Peak was eerily quiet, compared to the chaos we'd just experienced. As we picked our way down the treacherous slope, the weight of our recent victory, and the challenges still ahead, hung heavily in the air. "I can't believe we actually did it," Sarah murmured, breaking the silence. "We bound an elemental." Mike nodded, his face a mixture of awe and exhaustion. "Yeah, but at what cost? Look around us." He was right. The forest we were walking through bore little resemblance to the one we knew. Reality seemed to ripple and shift, trees morphing into impossible shapes before snapping back to normal. In the distance, I could have sworn I saw a waterfall flowing upwards. Lisa consulted the grimoire as we walked. "The binding of the air elemental has stabilized things somewhat, but the veil between worlds is still dangerously thin. We need to move quickly to the next site." I gripped the sword of St. Michael tightly, its weight both reassuring and terrifying. "Which element is next?" "Fire," Lisa replied, her voice grim. "And if the air site was any indication, it's going to be even more dangerous." As if on cue, a distant roar echoed through the twisted landscape, causing us all to freeze in our tracks. Please tell me that was just the wind, Mike said, his attempt at humor falling flat. I shook my head. We need to keep moving. Lisa, where's the fire site located? She flipped through the grimoire. According to this, it's at the old steel mill on the outskirts of town. The Order believes the residual energy from the furnaces makes it a powerful conduit for elemental fire. Sarah's eyes widened. But that's on the other side of town. How are we supposed to get there without being seen? The whole place is probably crawling with cultists and other things by now. I took a deep breath, trying to think clearly despite the fatigue and fear. We'll have to go underground. The old mining tunnels should still run beneath most of the town. Mike looked skeptical. You want us to go into dark, cramped tunnels when reality itself is falling apart? That sounds like a recipe for disaster. You got a better idea? I shot back, perhaps more harshly than I intended. Before Mike could respond, the ground beneath our feet began to tremble. Cracks appeared in the earth, glowing with an ominous red light. Run! Lisa shouted, and we all scrambled to get clear as the forest floor began to collapse. We barely made it to stable ground when a massive, fiery hand burst from the newly formed chasm. It grasped at the air, as if searching for something, or someone. What the hell is that? Sarah gasped, her face pale with terror. Lisa's voice was barely a whisper. A fire elemental. They're becoming active, drawn by the weakening barriers between worlds. The hand retreated back into the earth, leaving behind a gaping wound in the forest floor. The message was clear. Our time was running out. I turned to my companions, seeing the fear in their eyes, but also the determination. Looks like the tunnels are our only option now. We need to get to that steel mill before things get any worse. Mike nodded grimly. Lead the way, fearless leader. As we set off towards the nearest mine entrance, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into the belly of the beast. The sword of St. Michael hummed softly at my side, a reminder of the power we wielded, and the responsibility that came with it. The battle for the air elemental had been hard fought, but I had a sinking feeling it was just a prelude to the inferno that awaited us. As we plunged into the darkness of the mining tunnels, the weight of our mission pressed down on me. 3 more elements to bind, 3 more chances to save our world, or lose everything trying. The old mining tunnels were a maze of darkness and decay. Our flashlights cast eerie shadows on the crumbling walls, and the air was thick with dust and the lingering scent of sulfur. We had been walking for what felt like hours, the oppressive silence broken only by the occasional distant rumble that shook loose dirt from the ceiling. Are you sure we're going the right way? Sarah whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. I consulted the crude map I'd sketched from memory. I think so. These tunnels should lead us right under the steel mill. Mike let out a low whistle. And then what? We just pop up and say, "Hey, mind if we disrupt your apocalyptic ritual?" Lisa, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly stopped. Wait, do you hear that? We all fell silent, straining our ears. At first I heard nothing but the pounding of my own heart. Then, faintly, I caught it. A rhythmic chanting, muffled but unmistakable. They're above us, Lisa whispered. The ritual must have already started. The sword at my side began to vibrate, its energy responding to the nearby elemental forces. I gripped it tightly, trying to draw strength from its power. Okay, I said, attempting to keep my voice steady. We need a plan. We can't just burst in there blindly. Sarah nodded. Maybe we could create a distraction, draw some of them away from the ritual site. Before anyone could respond, a bone-chilling screech echoed through the tunnel. We all instinctively huddled closer together. What was that? Mike hissed, his eyes wide with fear. Lisa's face had gone pale. A guardian. They must have sensed our presence. As if on cue, the tunnel behind us erupted in flames. A monstrous shape emerged from the inferno, a creature of living fire, its body a twisting mass of flames and molten rock. Run, I shouted, pushing the others ahead of me. We sprinted through the tunnels, the heat of the fire guardian close at our heels. The sword in my hand grew hot, almost painfully so, but I refused to let it go. Suddenly, the tunnel ahead of us collapsed, blocking our path. We were trapped. "Peter, do something!" Sarah cried, pressing herself against the wall as the Guardian approached. Time seemed to slow down. I could feel the sword's energy pulsing through me, resonating with the elemental forces around us. Without fully understanding what I was doing, I raised the blade and shouted words in a language I didn't recognize. A blast of pure energy erupted from the sword, colliding with the Fire Guardian. The creature let out an inhuman shriek as it was forced back, its flames flickering and diminishing. "How did you do that?" Mike gasped, staring at me in awe. I shook my head, feeling drained. I don't know. It was like the sword knew what to do. Lisa's eyes widened with realization. "Of course, the sword isn't just a weapon, it's a conduit for elemental energy. Peter, you're channeling its power." Before I could process this revelation, the ground beneath our feet began to shake violently. Cracks appeared in the tunnel walls, glowing with an ominous red light. "The ritual," Lisa breathed. "They're summoning the fire elemental. If we don't stop them now..." I gripped the sword tightly, feeling its power coursing through me. "Then we fight our way up. Together." As one, we turned to face the partially collapsed tunnel ahead. With a shared nod of determination, we began to clear a path, the sounds of the ritual growing louder above us. Time was running out. The fire elemental was awakening, and we were the only ones standing between it and the destruction of our world. As we clawed our way towards the surface, I silently prayed that the power of the sword and the strength of our bond would be enough to face the inferno that awaited us. We emerged from the tunnels into a scene of absolute chaos. The old steel mill, once a symbol of our town's industrial past, had been transformed into a hellish landscape. The massive furnaces, long dormant, now blazed with otherworldly fire. Cultists in red robes chanted in a circle around the central pit, their voices rising above the roar of the flames. "Holy shit," Mike whispered, his face pale in the fiery glow. I gripped the sword of St. Michael tightly, feeling its power pulse in response to the elemental energies swirling around us. "Remember the plan," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Lisa, you're on spell duty. Sarah and Mike, disrupt the circle. I'll handle the Guardian." As if summoned by my words, a massive shape rose from the flames. It was vaguely humanoid, but its body was composed entirely of living fire, its eyes twin infernos of malevolence. "Peter, look out!" Sarah screamed. I barely had time to raise the sword before the Fire Guardian lashed out with a whip-like tendril of flame. The blade met the attack, and I felt a surge of energy course through me. The Guardian recoiled, its flames flickering uncertainly. "Go!" I shouted to the others. "I'll keep it busy." As my friends sprinted towards the circle of cultists, I faced off against the Guardian. Each clash of flame against sword sent shockwaves through the air, the elemental forces battling for supremacy. Across the room, I caught glimpses of the others in action. Mike and Sarah were tag-teaming cultists, using their knowledge of pressure points to incapacitate them without killing. Lisa had found a vantage point and was furiously leafing through the grimoire, her lips moving in silent incantation. The Fire Guardian pressed its attack, growing more frenzied as it sensed its summoners were under threat. I parried blow after blow, the sword moving almost of its own accord. But I could feel my strength waning. "Lisa," I called out, my voice hoarse from the heat and smoke. "We need that binding spell now." "I'm trying," she shouted back. "But the elemental's too strong. We need to weaken it somehow." As if in response to her words, the central furnace erupted. A column of fire shot towards the ceiling, coalescing into a form that dwarfed even the Guardian. The fire elemental had awakened. "Oh, come on," Mike yelled in frustration. "Can't we catch a break?" The elemental's appearance sent the remaining cultists into a frenzy. Their chanting reached a fever pitch, and I could feel the very air vibrating with power. Sarah fought her way to my side, her face streaked with soot. "Peter, what do we do?" I looked from the Guardian to the elemental, then down at the sword in my hand. An idea formed, crazy and desperate. "Lisa," I shouted. The sword. It's a conduit, remember? What if we use it to channel the elemental's own power against it? Lisa's eyes widened with realization. It could work. But Peter, the risk. We don't have a choice, I said grimly. I turned to Sarah and Mike. Keep the cultists off me. This is gonna get rough. Before they could protest, I charged towards the fire elemental. The Guardian moved to intercept me, but I slid beneath its grasp, feeling the heat sear my skin. As I approached the elemental, I raised the sword high. Hey, ugly, over here! The elemental's burning gaze fixed on me. I felt a moment of pure terror as it reached out with a massive hand of flame, but instead of flinching away, I thrust the sword forward directly into its fiery core. The world exploded into light and heat. I heard Lisa's voice chanting the binding spell, but it seemed to come from very far away. Every nerve in my body screamed in agony as the elemental's power coursed through me and into the sword. I couldn't see, I couldn't breathe. I could only hold on, praying that my friends would complete the ritual before I was consumed by the inferno. Then, suddenly, silence. The fire elemental collapsed in on itself, drawn into the sword with a final earth-shaking roar. The Guardian dissipated like mist in sunlight. The cultists' chants turned to screams of despair. As the smoke cleared, I found myself on my knees, the sword glowing white-hot in my blistered hands. My friends rushed to my side, their faces a mixture of awe and concern. Peter, Sarah breathed, helping me to my feet. You did it. You actually did it. I managed a weak smile, leaning heavily on her shoulder. We did it. Together. As we surveyed the smoldering remains of the steel mill, a somber realization settled over us. We had won this battle, but at a great cost. And with two elements still unbound, our greatest challenges were yet to come. Mike voiced what we were all thinking. So, who's ready for round 3? Despite everything, I couldn't help but laugh. As long as we had each other, there was hope. And right now, that was enough. The aftermath of binding the fire elemental left us battered, exhausted, and on edge. We retreated to Lisa's family cabin on the outskirts of town, hoping for a moment of respite before facing our next challenge. The small wooden structure, usually a haven of peace, now felt like the last bastion of normalcy in a world rapidly unraveling. I sat on the porch, the sword of St. Michael across my lap, its blade still warm to the touch. Sarah emerged from the cabin, 2 steaming mugs in hand. Thought you could use this, she said softly, offering me one. I accepted gratefully, wincing as the hot ceramic pressed against my still tender palms. Thanks. How are the others? Sarah sighed, settling beside me. Mike's passed out on the couch. Lisa's still poring over that grimoire, trying to figure out our next move. We sat in companionable silence for a moment, sipping our drinks and watching the strange, shimmering distortions in the air, a constant reminder of how thin the veil between worlds had become. Peter, Sarah began hesitantly, what you did back there, with the fire elemental, it was incredible and terrifying. For a moment I thought we'd lost you. I met her gaze, seeing the fear and admiration warring in her eyes. Honestly, so did I. But we didn't have a choice, and we still don't. Before Sarah could respond, Lisa burst out of the cabin, her face pale with urgency. Guys, we have a problem. A big one. Mike stumbled out behind her, rubbing sleep from his eyes. What now? Please tell me it's not another Guardian. Lisa shook her head, clutching the grimoire to her chest. Worse. I've been analyzing the elemental bindings, and I've realized something. Each time we bind an elemental, it's not just affecting our world, it's changing the fundamental balance of reality. A chill ran down my spine, colder than any elemental ice. What are you saying, Lisa? She took a deep breath. I'm saying that if we bind the water and earth elementals like we did the others, we might save our world, but we'll destroy countless others in the process. The cosmic balance will be irreparably shattered. Silence fell over our group as the weight of her words sank in. Mike was the first to break it. So what? We just give up? Let our world burn to save others we've never even seen? Sarah's voice was quiet but firm. There has to be another way. Lisa, is there anything in that book about an alternative? Lisa hesitated. There might be, but it's dangerous. Really dangerous. I stood up, gripping the sword tightly. At this point, I think dangerous is our default setting. What is it? Instead of binding the elementals, Lisa explained, we could try to restore the balance. But to do that, we'd need to enter the elemental planes themselves. We'd be going into their world, not just fighting them in ours. Mike let out a low whistle. You're right. That does sound dangerous. And probably impossible. I looked at each of my friends in turn, seeing the fear in their eyes, but also the determination. We'd come too far to back down now. When do we start? I asked. Lisa managed a grim smile. The veil is thinnest at the confluence of the four elements. There's a place where a river meets the sea, near a dormant volcano. If we can get there, we might be able to cross over. Sarah nodded. Okay. So we have a destination. But how do we get there? In case you haven't noticed, the world's gone a bit mad out there. As if to emphasize her point, a flock of birds flew past. Only they weren't birds anymore, but strange, chittering things with too many wings and eyes that glowed an unnatural blue. I tightened my grip on the sword, feeling its power hum in response to my resolve. We'll find a way. We have to. The fate of not just our world, but all worlds depends on it. As we began to gather supplies and plan our journey, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were stepping off the edge of a cliff into the unknown. But looking at my friends, battered, scared, but unbroken, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. The elementals awaited us in their own realm. It was time to take the fight to them. The journey to the elemental confluence was a nightmare of twisted landscapes and reality-bending encounters. What should have been a day's drive stretched into an endless odyssey through a world we barely recognized anymore. Our beat-up SUV crawled along roads that writhed like serpents, past forests where the trees whispered ancient secrets, and through towns where the inhabitants' eyes gleamed with an otherworldly light. Mike white-knuckled the steering wheel, his jaw clenched tight. I swear that gas station we just passed is the third one that looked exactly like my great-aunt Mildred's house, he muttered. Sarah, navigating from the passenger seat, squinted at the map. I think we're getting close. The airfield, different. She was right. There was a charge to the atmosphere, a prickling sensation on my skin that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The sword of St. Michael, resting across my lap, thrummed with energy. Lisa leaned forward from the back seat. Stop the car, she said suddenly. We need to go on foot from here. Mike pulled over, and we piled out, stretching cramped limbs and surveying our surroundings. The landscape before us was an impossible jumble of elemental forces. To our left, a river of liquid fire cut through a field of ice. To our right, floating islands of earth hovered above a churning sea. Well, I said, trying to inject some confidence into my voice. I guess this is it. The confluence of the elements. Sarah hefted her backpack. So, how exactly do we cross over into the elemental planes? Lisa consulted the grimoire. According to this, we need to find the exact point where all four elements meet. It should create a sort of portal. We set off, picking our way carefully through the chaotic terrain. The very ground beneath our feet seemed to shift and change with each step. After what felt like hours of searching, we finally spotted it. A swirling vortex of elemental energies, right at the center of the maelstrom. That's our ticket in, Lisa shouted over the roar of wind and fire. But once we're through, there's no guarantee we can come back the same way. Mike laughed, a slightly hysterical edge to his voice. Oh great, so it's a one-way trip to elemental hell. Sign me up. I gripped the sword tightly. feeling its power respond to the nearby portal. We don't have a choice. It's this, or watch our world tear itself apart. Sarah reached out and took my free hand. Together, then? I nodded, grateful for her steady presence. Together. As we approached the vortex, the elemental forces grew wilder. Wind whipped at our clothes, embers singed our skin, and the ground trembled beneath our feet. Just as we were about to step into the swirling energy, a bone-chilling roar split the air. We turned to see 4 massive shapes materializing around us, the elemental guardians, more powerful than ever in this liminal space. "Oh, come on!" Mike yelled. "Can't we catch a break?" There was no time to formulate a plan. The guardians attacked as one, a devastating onslaught of fire, water, earth, and air. "Into the portal!" I shouted, raising the sword. "I'll hold them off." "Like hell you will," Sarah retorted, planting herself firmly by my side. "We started this together, we'll finish it together." Mike and Lisa flanked us, forming a protective circle. "What they said," Mike added with a grim smile. As the guardians closed in, I felt a surge of power unlike anything I'd experienced before. The sword blazed with light, and I realized it wasn't just my own strength I was drawing on, but that of my friends as well. With a defiant yell, we charged forward, 4 humans against the primal forces of nature itself. The clash of energies was blinding, deafening. For a moment, I thought we'd be torn apart. Then suddenly, we were falling. The world around us dissolved into a kaleidoscope of elemental chaos. We clung to each other as reality itself seemed to stretch and warp. With a thunderous crack, we landed hard on solid ground. As my vision cleared, I looked around in awe and terror. We were no longer in our world. The elemental plane stretched out before us, vast and alien and beautiful. Our greatest challenge yet had only just begun. The elemental plane was a realm of impossible beauty and terrifying power. We stood on a floating island of earth suspended in a vast expanse of swirling elemental energies, rivers of fire intertwined with streams of water, while tornadoes of air carved paths through mountains that formed and crumbled in the blink of an eye. "Well," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't think we're in Kansas anymore." Sarah turned slowly, taking in the otherworldly landscape. "It's incredible and horrifying." Lisa was already consulting the grimoire, her brow furrowed in concentration. "According to this, we need to find the nexus, the point where all elemental forces converge. That's where we can attempt to restore the balance." I gripped the sword of St. Michael tightly, feeling its power pulse in response to the raw elemental energy surrounding us. Any idea which direction that might be? Before Lisa could respond, the ground beneath our feet began to tremble. The floating island we stood on started to break apart, chunks of earth drifting away into the void. "Move!" I shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand and leaping to a nearby platform of solidified air. Mike and Lisa scrambled after us, barely making it as our original perch disintegrated entirely. We stood there catching our breath, the reality of our situation sinking in. "Okay," Mike panted. "New rule. Trust nothing in this place, especially not the ground." As if in response to his words, a massive shape began to coalesce in the distance. It was vaguely humanoid, but its body was a swirling mass of earth, air, fire, and water in constant flux. Lisa's eyes widened in recognition. "That's it. The elemental avatar. The physical manifestation of the 4 elements combined. The nexus must be inside it." The avatar turned its gaze upon us, its eyes blazing with primordial power. When it spoke, its voice was a cacophony of rumbling earth, roaring fire, crashing waves, and howling wind. "Intruders!" it boomed. "You do not belong here. Your presence disrupts the balance." I stepped forward, raising the sword. "That's why we've come. To restore the balance, in our world and yours." The avatar's form rippled, the elements within it clashing violently. "Your actions have caused this imbalance. Why should we trust you to fix it?" Sarah moved to stand beside me, her voice steady despite her fear. Because we understand now. We see the consequences of our actions, and we want to make it right. We don't want to bind or control you, Lisa added. We want to work with you, to find a way for both our worlds to coexist in harmony. The Avatar seemed to consider this for a moment. Then, without warning, it unleashed a barrage of elemental fury upon us. Words are meaningless, it roared. If you truly seek balance, you must prove yourselves worthy. I raised the sword, deflecting a stream of fire, but I knew we couldn't last long against this onslaught. Any ideas? I shouted to the others. Mike, dodging a boulder, called back, Yeah, how about we don't die? Lisa's eyes suddenly lit up with realization. The sword, Peter. It's a conduit, remember? Maybe you can use it to channel the elemental energies, show the Avatar we can work in harmony with the elements. It was a desperate plan, but it was all we had. I took a deep breath, focusing on the sword and the power flowing through it. I could feel the elements around me, the solidity of earth, the freedom of air, the passion of fire, the fluidity of water. With a yell of defiance, I thrust the sword skyward. The elemental energies responded, swirling around the blade in a dazzling display of synchronized power. The Avatar paused its attack, its form stabilizing slightly. Interesting, it rumbled. Perhaps there is more to you than we first perceived. As the maelstrom of elements calmed, I lowered the sword, breathing heavily. We're not here to fight you, I said. We're here to learn, to understand. Help us restore the balance. Please. The Avatar regarded us silently for a long moment. Then slowly, it extended a massive hand formed of swirling elements. Come, it said. The path to balance will not be easy, but if you are truly committed, we will show you the way. Exchanging determined looks, my friends and I stepped forward together. As we were enveloped in the swirling elemental energies of the Avatar, I realized that our true trial was only just beginning. The fate of two worlds now rested in our hands.